For 17 years, the name Sully has stood for one unforgettable afternoon over New York City, a pilot who turned catastrophe into a story with no casualties. But this summer, the man behind that legend gave the world a very different kind of news, one that has nothing to do with engines or runways and everything to do with time. At 75, Captain Sully Sullenberger has revealed that he is living with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, and in doing so, he has opened up what may be the most quietly courageous chapter of his life. A Texas childhood built on discipline. Chesley Burnett Sullenberger III was born on January 23, 1951, in Denison, Texas, into a family with deep Swiss-German roots. From an early age he showed the kind of focus that would later define his career. He built model aircraft, watched military jets streak overhead from a nearby airbase, and by his early teens was already flying gliders. He earned a glider license at 14 and was piloting powered aircraft by 16, all while excelling academically to the point of qualifying for Mensa as a child. That combination of intellect and aviation obsession carried him to the United States Air Force Academy, where he graduated as the top flyer in his class. The Air Force sent him on to Purdue University, where he studied industrial and organizational psychology, a field focused on how people think, communicate, and make decisions under pressure. It would turn out to be the perfect academic foundation for a man whose defining moment decades later would hinge on split-second judgment. He went on to fly the F-4 Phantom II with fighter squadrons before leaving active duty in 1980 to join the commercial airline industry, eventually settling in with U.S. Airways and its predecessor carriers. Decades spent studying what goes wrong. What most passengers never realized boarding his flights over the following decades was that their captain had built an entire second career around aviation safety. Sullenberger worked as an accident investigator, served in leadership roles within the Airline Pilots Association, and helped shape crew resource management training that reshaped how cockpit crews communicate during emergencies. In 2007 he founded a consulting firm aimed at applying lessons from aviation to other high-stakes industries such as healthcare and manufacturing. He was, by the time January 2009 arrived, arguably one of the most prepared pilots in America for a crisis nobody could have predicted. The Hudson River landing. On January 15, 2009, Sullenberger was in command of U.S. Airways Flight 1549, an Airbus A320 that had just departed LaGuardia Airport bound for Charlotte, North Carolina. Roughly 2 minutes after takeoff, the plane struck a flock of Canada geese, and both engines lost power almost simultaneously. With First Officer Jeffrey Skiles beside him, Sullenberger quickly determined that neither LaGuardia nor the nearby Teterboro Airport could be reached safely, and made the decision to glide the powerless jet onto the Hudson River instead. The landing held together well enough that all 155 people aboard were able to evacuate onto the wings and into rescue boats that reached the aircraft within minutes. Sullenberger walked the aisle twice to make sure the cabin was empty before he became the last person to leave the sinking plane. Investigators later concluded that ditching in the river was, in fact, the correct call given how little altitude and time the crew had to work with. New York's mayor nicknamed him Captain Cool, though Sullenberger has since been candid that the composure people saw that day masked genuine fear, and that he dealt with sleeplessness and flashbacks resembling post-traumatic stress in the weeks that followed. The recognition that followed was immediate and enormous. President Bush called him personally. President-elect Obama invited the crew to his inauguration. Congress passed resolutions honoring the crew and the ferry and tugboat operators who helped pull passengers from the frigid water. New York City gave him a key to the city, and Time magazine ranked him among the year's most influential people. The aircraft itself now sits on permanent display at what is today the Sullenberger Aviation Museum in Charlotte. From cockpit to advocate. Rather than fading from public life after 2009, Sullenberger used his platform to keep pushing for safer skies. He retired from flying in 2010 but continued testifying before Congress on pilot training standards, crew rest requirements, and aircraft certification. In the years following major crashes involving Boeing 737 MAX, he was outspoken about what he saw as a system in which manufacturers and regulators had grown too close, arguing that warning signs had gone unaddressed. In 2021, President Biden nominated him to serve as United States Ambassador to the International Civil Aviation Organization, and after Senate confirmation he presented his credentials in Montreal in early 2022, serving through that summer. Away from hearings and headlines, his home life in Danville, California, stayed grounded. He married Lori Henry in 1989, and the couple raised 2 daughters, Katie and Kelly, who have since given the family a granddaughter as well. His story reached an even wider audience in 2016 with the release of the film, Sully, directed by Clint Eastwood and starring Tom Hanks, which introduced a new generation to the details of that January afternoon. Building a reputation before the world was watching. It's worth remembering that Sullenberger's reputation for meticulousness didn't appear out of nowhere on the day of the Hudson landing. Colleagues who flew with him in the years before 2009 have long described a captain who treated routine flights with the same seriousness he'd later show in a genuine emergency, someone who studied near misses and minor incidents almost obsessively in search of patterns that could prevent future tragedies. That habit of mind shaped the training programs he helped develop and the testimony he later gave before Congress, where he pushed regulators to think less about reacting to disasters after they happened and more about designing systems that caught problems earlier. It's a mindset that, in hindsight, feels directly connected to how he's chosen to handle his own diagnosis. Catch it early, understand it fully, and talk about it honestly rather than waiting until it can no longer be managed quietly. A different kind of announcement. On July 14, 2026, Sullenberger shared news through a personal statement and an interview with People magazine that reframed how the public understands this stage of his life. He revealed that he had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease in August of 2025, after noticing that his once photographic memory had started slipping roughly a year earlier, trouble pulling up a name, catching himself retelling a story he'd already shared, restless nights. In his own words, he described the disease as the unwanted visitor at the door, a phrase that captured both the intrusion of the diagnosis and his refusal to let it define him. He said plainly that he considers himself at the beginning of a long journey, choosing the same unadorned, matter-of-fact language he once used to describe the technical realities of the Hudson landing rather than reaching for anything more dramatic. Sullenberger has spoken openly about working with Dr. Gil Rabinavasai, a memory and aging specialist at UCSF Medical Center in San Francisco, saying his doctor helped him understand how widespread the disease really is. Alzheimer's currently affects more than 7 million Americans, according to the Alzheimer's Association, and there remains no cure, though earlier detection tools and newer treatment options have expanded what recently diagnosed patients can do to manage the disease and plan ahead. Medical commentary following the announcement noted that late-onset diagnoses like his, arriving at 75, are somewhat more typical than early-onset cases, and some physicians have pointed out that the post-traumatic stress Sullenberger experienced after Flight 1549 may have been a contributing risk factor, since chronic stress and disrupted sleep are known to affect long-term brain health. He explained his decision to go public in terms that echoed the philosophy he has repeated for years about the Hudson landing, that courage, once shown, tends to spread to other people facing their own hard moments. He framed the disclosure as an extension of that same idea, hoping that by naming his diagnosis openly, other families quietly living with Alzheimer's might feel less alone in it. It is not the first time he has chosen transparency over comfort. He was candid years earlier about the psychological aftermath of the Hudson landing, and about the grief of losing his father, who died by suicide, disclosures that helped normalize conversations many public figures still tend to avoid. We will be courageous together. His wife, Lori, offered her own reflection on the diagnosis, telling people that the steadiness her husband showed before and after Flight 1549 is the same steadiness carrying the family now. She described their approach as continuing to live fully, hold on to hope, and find joy in ordinary moments even with an uncertain future ahead. Sullenberger himself struck a similar note, saying the disease may reshape how he holds on to memories of the past but will not stop him from looking forward to and appreciating whatever comes next, adding that he and his family intend to face it together. Longtime colleagues have echoed that same theme. Jeff Skiles, his first officer on Flight 1549 and a close friend in the years since, said he was genuinely surprised by the diagnosis, describing Sullenberger as someone who still seems larger than life, and someone most people wouldn't suspect was dealing with anything at all. That sense of continuity, friends say, is very much the point. Despite the diagnosis, Sullenberger has continued taking on public commitments rather than stepping back from them. He is scheduled to be inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame in Washington, D.C., in September 2026, a milestone that will place his name alongside the pioneers of American flight even as he manages a very different kind of challenge behind the scenes. A continuous story. Taken as a whole, Sullenberger's life reads as a single through line rather than a series of disconnected chapters. A Texas kid obsessed with flight, a fighter pilot, an airline captain who happened to be in command on the one afternoon everything went wrong, a safety advocate who spent decades trying to prevent the next disaster, a diplomat representing American aviation on the world stage, and now a public voice for a disease that touches millions of families quietly, one memory at a time. He has said the same instinct that made him walk the aisle of a sinking plane twice before allowing himself to leave, making sure everyone else was accounted for first, is the instinct guiding him now as he chooses to speak for himself rather than let the diagnosis be defined by others. For a man whose public identity was built around 208 seconds of extraordinary calm above the Hudson River, this latest announcement doesn't read like an ending. It reads like the same man applying the same discipline to a much harder and much longer flight, one where there is no river to land on, only the choice to keep showing up one day at a time for the people counting on him. Why his story matters beyond aviation. Public health experts who track Alzheimer's advocacy have noted that when a widely recognized figure discloses a diagnosis this openly, it tends to have a measurable effect on how willing ordinary families are to seek an evaluation themselves, rather than dismissing early memory changes as an inevitable part of getting older. Sullenberger's decision to name his own physician, describe his specific symptoms, and put a date on when he first noticed changes gives other people a concrete template for recognizing the same signs in themselves or a loved one. Trouble finding the right word, repeating a story without realizing it, sleep that no longer feels restorative. None of those signs are proof of Alzheimer's on their own, but taken together and persisting over time, they're exactly the kind of pattern doctors say is worth raising with a physician rather than waiting out. That is, in its own way, consistent with everything Sullenberger has spent his career arguing for. That the earlier a problem is identified, honestly and without denial, the more options there are for managing it well. He spent decades trying to get the aviation industry to operate that way. Now he's applying the same philosophy to his own health, in full view of the public that once watched him walk a plane's aisle twice to make sure no one was left behind.